How did Etsy go from a valuation of a whopping $37.6 billion to being worth merely a fraction of that, while in the process creating a multitude of problems for their company? Etsy at one point in time was seen as a crafty cross between Amazon, eBay, and your grandma's basement. Today though, Etsy sellers and buyers say that the site resembles a more expensive Amazon and that the quality of products is dropping more and more every day. Etsy was once seen as a niche online retailer that was the perfect place to buy and sell handmade vintage goods made by individual sellers. Unfortunately, dropshippers, counterfeit and copyright infringing products, and art made by AI now plagues the online marketplace. The company's stock also sits down 84% from its all-time high due to the company's inability to increase profits. So, how did Etsy end up in this position? Let's find out. Before we go over the rise and fall of Etsy, we need to first learn a little bit more about the company. Etsy was created in 2005 by a trio of entrepreneurs in their Brooklyn apartment. The vision for the website was to create a platform for craftsmen to sell their unique goods. One of the founders, Rob Kalin, later revealed that the trio came up with the name Etsy after watching an Italian movie and hearing Etsy a lot, which means oh yes in Italian. The founders were looking for a nonsense word to name their company, and really liked the sound of Etsy, so they decided to replace the I with a Y, and thus Etsy was born. Etsy's slogan from very early on in the company's life cycle has been to keep commerce human. Like I just mentioned, Etsy's goal was to connect craftsmen creating unique goods directly with buyers. At a time when online shopping was becoming more and more prevalent, Etsy aimed to separate itself from larger online retailers and foster a community that appreciated handmade goods rather than mass-produced products. Etsy's mission was instantly a success. The company sold its first product, a flamingo print zip pouch, for $8 shortly after launching in 2005. By the end of that first year, Etsy had done over $1 million in gross merchandise sales, meaning Etsy buyers bought more than $1 million worth of goods from Etsy sellers. Fast forward nearly 2 decades later to the end of 2024, and Etsy had 100 million items in its marketplace, with 8 million verified sellers and 96 million buyers. Additionally, as a result of the company's commission and listing fees, Etsy has reported increasing revenue every year. However, despite these promising figures, the company's stock has plummeted in recent years, and despite revenue increasing every year, Etsy has seen decreasing net profit. So, what exactly is going on with Etsy? Let's get into the rise and fall of the company. But before we do that, I would appreciate if you like the video and subscribe if you like what you're seeing. My first reason for the rise of Etsy is quite obvious, but it's the fact that Etsy focused on a niche market. Like I've already mentioned, Etsy is centered around offering handcrafted and vintage goods made by individual artists. This is clarified in Etsy's creativity standards on their website, which have always stated that physical items must be made by the seller by hand. This creativity standards rulebook has changed quite a bit since Etsy's release back in 2005, and has led to a lot of controversy, but more on that later. Etsy's emphasis on products being strictly handmade has created a niche market that other massive online retailers like Amazon, Alibaba, and eBay are unable to compete with. For example, if you wanted a generic diamond necklace for cheap, Amazon would be the place to go. However, if you wanted a personalized necklace with the name of your choosing on it, Etsy would not only be the best place to go, but also one of the only places to go. Through this example, you can see how Etsy has carved out its unique audience within the online retail industry. My next reason for the rise of Etsy is the pandemic. The world shutting down in 2020 allowed Etsy sellers to spend more time creating goods to sell on the site, and also allowed Etsy buyers to spend more time roaming the site to find goods to order. The gross merchandise value of items sold on the site jumped to $2.69 billion in Q2 of 2020, over $1 billion more than the previous quarter. The company's revenue also jumped nearly $1 billion from 2019 to 2020. And after the company IPO'd in 2015 at a little over $27 per share, the share price skyrocketed during the pandemic, hitting an all-time high of over $291 in 2021. This gave the niche online retailer a valuation of a staggering $37.6 billion. But despite the company's massive success during the pandemic, the cracks in the company had already begun to form years earlier. The pandemic for Etsy was like putting a band-aid on a fatal wound. It provided temporary relief, but it didn't actually solve the problem. Today, Etsy's revenue has more or less flattened out, and the company's net profit has been slightly above $300 million the past few years, nowhere near their pandemic high of $494 million in 2021. As a result, the company's stock today sits around $46, an 84% decrease from its pandemic all-time high. So, where did Etsy go wrong? My first reason for the fall of Etsy is the lowered quality of products that the site has today. When the site first launched, 100% of the goods available on the site were made to order, unique products that were made exclusively by the seller. However, in late 2014, Etsy updated their creativity standards to allow sellers to be able to sell things that they only designed or sourced, even if they didn't end up actually making the product. In other words, items sold on Etsy no longer had to be handmade by the seller. This opened the floodgates for dropshippers to be able to sell on Etsy. If you're not familiar with dropshipping, here's a simplified example. A customer orders a product from your store for $100. You then send the order to your supplier along with $50 to pay for the order. The supplier then fulfills the order and ships it directly to the customer, allowing you to keep $50 profit. The problem with dropshipping is not only that it causes the prices for the customer to increase due to the fact that the store has to pay the supplier, but it also causes the quality of the product to drop. This is because dropshippers will generally dropship generic products that can be bought and sold in large quantities. In a Reddit post made by an Etsy seller, this dropshipping issue is shown clearly. The user shows 4 different Etsy sellers selling the same exact handmade journal cover. The user also adds that this will be the death of Etsy if they don't crack down on this stuff. Dropshipping is not the only cause for the lowered quality of products on Etsy though. The site has also been plagued with counterfeit products and copyright infringing products, and more recently, AI-generated products. As one Etsy seller put it, it's impossible to compete against dropshippers, AI art, and digital sellers who don't follow licensing rules. And not only are Etsy sellers unhappy because this takes away money from them, but buyers are also unhappy because the quality of products has dropped as a result. My next reason for the fall of Etsy is the fact that the company became a publicly traded company. As a result of going public, Etsy prioritized profits over everything else. Now, you may be thinking, duh, of course a public company will prioritize profits over everything. But the thing is that a company like Etsy should never go public. For a company like Etsy whose target audience is people buying unique, handmade items, growth in perpetuity is not really sustainable long term. In an effort to please shareholders, Etsy has continuously hiked their fees. For example, in 2022, they increased their transaction fee by 30%, from 5% to 6.5% on every single sale on the site. Price hikes like this are done at the expense of the sellers, who are obviously not going to be happy that Etsy is now taking more of their money for each product that they sell. Maybe you're saying, too bad if the sellers are unhappy. Etsy is a publicly traded company, so they should be doing whatever they want to bring in more money. Well, like I went over earlier, they're not even bringing in more money. They have seen declining net profit the past couple years and haven't returned to their pandemic high of nearly $500 million in net profit. So even with the emphasis on profits due to being a public company, they still haven't seen an increase in profits. This causes both company executives to be unhappy because they aren't seeing increased profits, and also sellers and buyers on the site to be unhappy as a result of increased fees. It's truly a lose-lose situation. My final reason for the fall of Etsy is their poor treatment of their sellers. For example, there are Reddit posts of sellers complaining about customers opening cases with Etsy claiming non-delivery despite the customer signing for receiving the package. In one Reddit post, the seller states that a customer pulled this scam with the $1,400 watch, and that Etsy sided with the customer despite the customer signing for delivery of the package. The seller says, do not sell expensive items on Etsy. They do not have your back in cases of fraud, even with overwhelming evidence. The far more common issue though is Etsy closing seller shops for seemingly random reasons. One seller on Reddit shared that Etsy shut down his shop that had over 3,700 sales, and received no email from Etsy or any reasoning as to why their account was shut down. Another seller shared that they had an Etsy shop that was randomly closed with no explanation, and that they had heard this happen to many other sellers. Etsy's poor treatment of their sellers is a head-scratcher because, after all, the sellers are the reason Etsy is able to function and make money. The lowered quality of products available on Etsy, paired with the company's pursuit of profits and poor treatment of sellers, has seen Etsy lose tens of billions of dollars in valuation. Today, the company's share price is nowhere near its all-time high, and will likely continue to fall unless Etsy makes significant changes. Will Etsy ever be able to recover? Only time will tell.